Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning? Welcome to a very special episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast, a student-led project where we explore the history and human stories shaping the Middle East conflict. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Efe.
Today, we have the great privilege of welcoming Professor Norman Stillman, one of the world's foremost authorities on Jewish-Muslim relations across the Arab world and Iran. Few scholars combine his mastery of languages, archival depth, and decades of sustained scholarship. His work shows that this history cannot be reduced to a simple tale of either harmony or conflict. Instead, it reveals long periods of coexistence, creativity, and remarkable cultural flourishing, alongside moments of tension and hardship. In its high points, life for Jewish communities in the Islamic world was often far more secure and intellectually vibrant than in Christian Europe. One outstanding example is the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a great center of learning where Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars translated Greek philosophy, advanced medicine, and deepened astronomy together, creating a shared intellectual heritage that shaped world civilization. Professor Stillman is the executive director of the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World, the most comprehensive reference work ever produced on this subject. His two seminal books, The Jews of Arab Lands, a history and source book, and The Jews of Arab Lands in Modern Times, remain indispensable for anyone who seeks to understand how these deep historical interactions inform the present. We're truly fortunate to have Professor Stillman with us to guide us through this rich and complex past.
For us, it's an incredible honor to have him here. A very warm welcome, Professor Stillman.
Thank you very much. I'm honored as well.
Also from me, a very warm welcome.
Diving right into the first questions. How far does Jewish life in the Middle East and North Africa date back? How did it look like before modern times? And where were these communities and what roles did they play in local society?
Jewish presence in the Middle East, and in fact the Mediterranean littoral, goes back to antiquity, already to the period of the First Temple, when, remember, the Phoenicians carried out trade throughout the Mediterranean, and that a number of the port cities of North Africa and of Spain were founded by the Phoenicians in what is, of course, today Lebanon. We know that they were Jews in these communities as well, merchants, and some of these we learn about them. They were also in Egypt. We know about them from Greek and Roman historians. We know about them from the Church Fathers. Augustine, of course, remember, who was a North African from what is today Algeria, Tunisia border. He mentions them. Geographers, actually, some of the Latin geographers refer to Judei et alii mercatoris, Jews and the other merchants, meaning that so many of them were involved in Mediterranean trade. During the revolt against Rome, Jews in, for example, Egypt took part as well and suffered accordingly. So by the time Islam comes on the scene of history, there's been a long history of Jews in the Middle East, and we'll see that plays a part actually even into the Islamic conquests, because just remember, timing is very important. There are good times and bad times, and the period when Islam rises on the scene of history is a particularly bad time for example, for Jews in the Christian world. The Byzantines and the Sasanians, the two great empires in the East, the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Sasanians, the Persian Empire, had been fighting for centuries. Jews overwhelmingly preferred the Sasanians, who were Zoroastrians. And for a while, the Sasanians took over Jerusalem, and for the 2 or 3 years that the Sasanians took over the Holy Land, of course they were thrown out again, and the emperor of the Byzantine Empire passed a law, or declared a law, that Jews had to convert to Christianity. So, needless to say, they were not happy, and that's the eve of the Muslim conquest. And this is why Jews looked upon the Muslim conquest generally as liberating them from Christian persecution. We see this in Jews don't write history at that time, but we see it in Midrashei Geula. These are supposedly these are like hadith in Islam. These are story commentaries, but one sees the in one of them, the Misterot Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. An angel tells this famous rabbi, who of course has long been dead, don't worry, God is sending the Ishmaelites to save you from the Christians. And we see in a number of places that they, for the most part, they were in no position to do anything. But in 1 or 2 places, Caesarea, we know this from early Muslim historians like al-Baladhiri, Caesarea, they helped show them a way to get through the city walls through a secret tunnel. In Spain, where Jews also had been ordered to undergo forced conversion, and where the Muslim conquerors were a tiny minority who invaded the peninsula, they would conquer a city and then leave it in the hands of a garrison of local Jews as they continued on. In some places, Christians also played this role. For example, in Halab, in Aleppo, where remember, there's no one Christianity, and the different denominations of Christianity were not always liberal to one another. And the local Christians, for example, we know from the Muslim historians, by the way, all of whom are writing about 100 to 150 years later. So again, these we have to, of course, look at all of this with some grains of salt, but nevertheless, local Christians aided in the conquest, and the conquest as well. What would be called today collaboration. And in Iraq, which was there was no Iraq, it was of course ancient Babylonia. The prince of the exile, the supposed descendant of the house of David, who was the head of the Jewish community there since Second Temple times, at least, comes and welcomes the Caliph Ali when he comes into Iraq. So that there was a general feeling that this was an improvement. You have to also remember, Jews, first of all, ideas, and this is something that people forget about nowadays when they're talking about modern politics. Notions of equality, political equality, social equality, these did not exist. Nobody had them. You were a member of the dominant group or you weren't. However, you could be more tolerant of others or less so. And the early Islamic conquest, with at least for the Christians, many of the Christians, and certainly for the Jews, looked as an improvement in their situation. And we have a detailed history of the conquest, again written over a century afterwards, Al-Balaghi's Futuh al-Buldan, which goes into great detail about these things.
When Islam emerged in the 7th century, it encountered established Jewish communities. How did the Prophet Muhammad view the Jews of this time, and what aspect of religious practice and law did Islam most clearly inherit from Judaism?
That's like many questions in history, a complicated question. And it's clear his early encounters with Jews and Christians were positive and admirative. That is, remember, the Prophet was a merchant. He went on mercantile caravans on behalf of. He married his first wife, Khadija, was older than he, and she was very wealthy. He was actually a poor orphan, but he then handled her affairs, and it's clear that we know from other descriptions that very often merchants acted as unofficial missionaries and would give sermons in the marketplace and so on and so forth. And how do we know this? Because we have it in God's holy book and so on. And we know, and of course, from the biography of the Prophet, there is a theological biography of the Prophet Muhammad, the Sirah an-Nabawiyya, again written over a century after his time, but it does talk about encounters with priests and with others. And at least the way we as historians interpret this, one of the things that must have struck him is these people have, and of course people were talking about the end of the world being nigh, and so on. These people have salvation. What about my people? The other thing that must have struck him, again, this is now our analysis, this is not Islamic textual history. But one of the things that must have struck him is the Jews and the Christians, although they're different religions, not even particularly amicable with one another, they cite many of the same stories, the same sacred same sacred book, and so on. And he was the time, the 7th century and the late 6th century was a time. Remember, you had the great empires had fallen to a great extent. There wasn't the wealth that you had in the heyday of classical Greece and Rome, and many people turned to, as they do in such times, to mysticism and to deep contemplation. The Prophet was a sensitive individual, and he would sit at night outside of Mecca on a hillside and contemplate the heavens. why are we not? Do we not have our salvation? And then one night he got his answer. A figure appeared on the horizon and said to him, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insana min alaq, iqra wa rabbuka al-akram, alladhi allama bil-qalam, allama al-insana ma lam ya'lam." Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Recite, for your Lord is most gracious. He taught man what he did not know. And this became the first revelation of the Quran. It's not chapter 1. The Quran was put together after his death from the longest to the shortest passages, and this is one of the shorter ones. So it's near the end of the Quran, but it's a passage that every Muslim knows. He at first thought perhaps he was mad. He had a supportive wife, always very important, who said no, and a few others who said this must have been a divine revelation. And once that happened, they came more and more and more, and this becomes the Quran. And what's interesting is, and by the way, you could hear, even if you don't know Arabic, that it was rhymed, which is why it's easy to remember. There are people who, I don't know the whole Quran by heart, but I certainly know many large portions. And when I worked in the Arab world in the 1970s, when it was particularly dangerous both for an American and for someone of my own religious persuasion to be there, being able to cite the Quran verbatim it got me out of many sticky situations. So in any case, this became the first revelation, and then they come more and more. And what's interesting is many of the biblical stories, both from the Jewish Hebrew Bible and from the Christian New Testament, appear in some form or other in the Quran, not verbatim the way they appear in the Christian and Jewish scriptures, but actually as they appear in the commentaries, the what we call in Hebrew midrashim, these are, because in the Bible sometimes stories are very chopped up, they're short, and so on, or you're left wondering, what happened, and commentators filled in with rich details, usually for sermons, and this then gets set down into writing, and he must have heard some of these in the marketplaces that he traveled throughout the Middle East, and these are, in fact, the versions even that many people of the various religions remember, not the verbatim biblical version. And of course, I should add instantly that, of course, this is I'm saying this as a detached academic from the point of view of Islam. The answer is very clear. This was the original verbatim word in the divine scriptures in heaven, and what you have in the others are divine scriptures, but they have been what shall I say, somewhat corrupted over time. So that's always very, very important to emphasize, especially if you're talking with someone who is a Muslim believer, then you have to understand that.
How did the rise of Islam change the life of the Jewish communities in the region, and what do we know about the significance of Jewish communities within the Islamic world's earliest centuries?
Well, it changed it in many ways. For one thing, first of all, you have to understand Islam within a short time after the Prophet's death in 632, for about a year, you have others in Arabia, other Arab tribes who had converted to Islam, but then said, well, okay, we've converted to Islam, but we don't have to pay taxes anymore. You have others who said, well, wait a minute, you of the Quraysh had a prophet. We've got a prophet. And you had a number of what, of course, by Islamic standards are false prophets who appeared. And this is all put down. When Muhammad died, he had not, it was unexpected. The end of time was being awaited. And what did one do? When he went out of Medina on expeditions, he always left behind a lieutenant to be in charge of the ummah, of the community, when he left. Now that he was gone permanently, the closest followers decided to pick a lieutenant who would continue his project in as he would have done, and to run the community as was done when he was out on the battlefield, going against enemies. Within a year and a half, all of Arabia submits once and for all, and then almost by accident, some of the tribes. Arabia had been very much like the Greece that you see in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And one of the things one could do for recreation was go off on and have attack some enemies to get some booty and so on. And some of the Muslim Arab forces on the borders of the Persian Empire, in what would be today southern Iraq, went off on a raid and suddenly found, remember, the Persians and the Byzantines had been fighting for 200 years, 300 years, and they quickly found that they were conquering more and more. The same thing, of course, when they go up into on the other side into the Byzantine Empire, and within an amazingly short period of 15 years, the two greatest empires west of China and India are Byzantine Empire continues, of course, up until the end of the 15th century, middle of the 15th century, but Persian Empire disappears forever, and the Byzantine Middle East and North African Empire disappears. And by the way, in other places too, they received help from dissatisfied locals. In Egypt, the Copts considered themselves persecuted by the Byzantine Greek Orthodox, and they rose up against the Greek rulers as well, and joined with the Muslims. And within 15 years, the entire periphery of the Levant, what's today, remember these are partially modern names: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and then moving. North Africa is going to take them another 50 years to finish off, because it's a huge open territory, and it was in many ways lots of primitive empty space. But within 15 years, they've established all of this area in one of the heartlands of civilization, and the Muslims were a tiny minority in what they conquered, and they went on the principle that eventually becomes Islamic law, that the people of the book, the Ahl al-Kitab, those who have a scripture, scripture. That is, they have a divine revelation. Whether it's been corrupted or not is another story, but they do have a divine revelation. They do have genuine religion, not as good as Islam, but genuine, that they were not to be forcibly converted. And only idolaters, and you still had in the Middle East people who were idol worshippers from antiquity. And then Zoroastrians were also added to the. This is when the Zoroastrians set down their scripture in writing to show, you see, we have a scripture too. That they were now to become mawali. A mawla in Arab society was a protected person of a tribe. If I had to run away from where I lived and came to your tribe to live there, and I asked you to protect me, I became a mawla, and you were my wali. You were my protector. And with the conquest of Jerusalem, the Caliph Omar comes to Jerusalem for the signing of the peace treaty with the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and that becomes the basis of Islamic law, how non-Muslims are to be treated. They are, and it's called the Pact of Omar, the Ahd Omar. The version we have in Islamic law books is from 100 years later, because there are in various places, different. We know from the Islamic historians, different versions were made of how people. But basically, the conquered people had to pay taxes, show humility and respect before Muslims and public, but had the freedom to practice their religion uninhibited, no small concession at that time, especially in the Christian part of the world. Even Zoroastrians were more liberal, but in the Christian empire, that you could practice your religion as long as you did it quietly. You're not allowed to. Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians are not supposed to pray too loudly, nor to have public ceremonies. But other than that, you had freedom of economic endeavor, something European Christians did not allow non-Christians. You had limited things that you could. The only thing you were not supposed to do is sell wine to Muslims. Make it to. You could have it for yourself, but since Islam forbids it, you are not allowed to do it. That's one of the forbidden ones. And then there were certain rules which were observed at first, and then fell into desuetude. One of which was to not build homes higher than Muslims. Although we'll see that throughout history, some of these negative rules come back and forth, depending on how liberal the times are. But true, they were to live in their own quarters. But remember, the Muslims are a tiny ruling minority. They don't want to be absorbed into the local populations, and so they settled in camp towns all throughout the new empire. These camp towns are called Amsar, singular Misr. Arabic works on the mice principle, not the boys principle for making plurals. The plural is internalized in the word of most words. And these Ansar which were camp towns where the Muslims settled with their families, but basically they were guarding this whole entire area. But they needed people to provide them with goods and services, and locals were not allowed to live there, but they could come and provide the services, or they could convert to Islam, of course. And these camp towns, which, by the way, shows a shift in geography as well, because in the Greco-Roman world, where were all the important cities? Think of it from your own knowledge of history. Yeah, it's okay. You're not being tested. Yeah, you're supposed to be testing me, not me, you. They were on the coast. Athens, Rome. Rome isn't exactly on the coast, but it's connected by the Tiber to the coast. Athens is 4 kilometers from Piraeus, and so on. All the major cities were coastal cities, and now the Muslims whose lines of connection were overland by camel, by donkey, and so on, build them inland, well in from the coast. And this is when Fustat, which later becomes Cairo, takes over from Alexandria. This is when Kairouan in Tunisia takes over from what was the Phoenician capital. They'll come back to me. This is when Fez takes the place of Tangier, and so on. Over and over again, we see this. We see these coastal towns becoming the important. Caesarea, the Roman capital of Palestine, is now it's Ramla, which is not a big city anymore, but in fact it means pile of sand. Takes over as the administrative capital. The only big internal city that remained a capital was Damascus, and that's because, in part, it had a huge Arab population, was connected to Arabia by caravan routes, and so on. But all the others moved inland. In any case, the rules, all other rules in the Pact of Omar, non-Muslims were not supposed to dress like Muslims. They were to wear a certain identifying belt. Again, these rules go back and forth. Clearly, some of them had to do with military occupation. If you're a minority ruling over a large majority, you want to be able to recognize them. People didn't carry, passports or ID cards and so on. So this had to be on them. Later on, they also were not supposed to wear turbans, which again, we'll see that in liberal periods these rules very often got ignored. But at first they were strictly observed. And again, another thing was, of course, non-Muslims were not allowed to ride on horses with saddles. That probably was a matter of status. They had to, if they rode on anything, it had to be a donkey, and they had to ride side saddle. Again, we see throughout history, there are times this is strictly observed, and there are times that it is not strictly observed. But at first it was. And of course, this was a great incentive for more and more people and of course they had to pay taxes. There were 2 types of taxes. One in the Quran, the jizya, which in the Quran it just means some sort of tribute, but it comes over the next 100 years as Islamic law evolves. It develops into a capitation tax, a head tax. That is, every adult has to pay this tax, and it was graded on a basis of wealth. It was 5 dinars for the wealthy, 3 for the middle class, and 1 for the poor. And Islam, like Judaism, is a religion of law, this becomes, and this was not an easy tax. We see from documents from the Middle Ages, from the Cairo Geniza, the largest cache of documents ever found, including Europe has nothing comparable. These were the Jews had a religious rule not to throw away anything that had the name of God on it. How this collection, though, comes to be was found in Fustat, Old Cairo. It's about 250,000 documents. And it's everything from people's shopping lists to letters between family members. And probably people didn't check to see whether or not it had God in it or not. You better just, for the safety of it, put it in this storage room. And in the 19th century, it was discovered, and it's one of our greatest sources for the history, not only of Jews in the Islamic world, but of the Islamic world, of daily life, and so on, because we have nothing comparable to it otherwise. And in any case, these rules basically establish status, and I must say it was easier for Jews to accept them than Christians, because after all, Christians had been rulers. Jews had already been under foreign rule and in exile, as Jews see it. It's galut since the destruction of the Second Temple. And therefore, having more tolerant rulers was something that they looked upon positively. Christians, as I said, this was more difficult for them. And many, of course, Christians and some Jews also saw it. Well, you could go from being a tax-paying plebeian to be, and that was another thing, the Muslims who settled in these camp towns, the Amsar, all throughout the Middle East, they, of course, paid taxes, their taxes, but the Muslim taxes were totally different and much less. But you could go from being a tax-paying plebeian to being a pension. Those who were in these towns during the first generation after the conquest received from the Islamic State, because they were there guarding Islamic territory and overseeing things. And you could go to being a pension receipt, and if you got killed, your family got money to take care of them. Technically, you would be getting these same privileges. Needless to say, as more and more people converted to Islam in the next 100 years, the authorities were not enthusiastic about A, losing taxpayers, and B, paying people money. And at first, the internal strife in the Islamic world is between the Mawali, the new converts to Islam, and between the old Arab elite. Also, many of them are not Arab. But in the long run, this makes Islam even more open, in the sense that now it's not a matter of tribe, Arab tribe, and so on. It's the fact you're a Muslim. And this is when, in the 8th century and 9th century, we begin to have. I saw you had in your list of many questions. There was one about the Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad. The Abbasid dynasty, which is founded in 750, is basically supported by Mawali, by converts to Islam. The Abbasids are, of course, aristocratic Arabs, but the foundation of their power is in the people who are conquered and are now part of the Islamic community, and they make great use of them in their civil service, in many things, and they're very open to the intellectual influences of these people. And it's under the Abbasids in Baghdad. In the very fact, Baghdad has an Arabic name. It's Medinat al-Salam, the House of Peace, the City of Peace. But the fact that it even has a Persian name, Baghdad, Persian is since you're German, if you ever study Persian, you'll be, and especially if you've had Latin as well, you'll be surprised at the structural similarities because it's Indo-European. It has a huge Arabic vocabulary, just like English has a huge French-Latin vocabulary for technical terms, but the structure is Indo-European. Again, yeah, you would like that. You would like that, I'm sure. Especially, although you don't. Do you do Latin, by the way, in your school?
Yeah, we have Latin
okay.
in school.
Good to know. I gave a keynote address at Goethe University a couple of years ago, and I was the only public speaker because it was the keynote, and it was on Jews and the study of Islam, and so it was open to my talk was open to the public, and I get there are posters, and I had made this play on a famous line from a Latin play by Terentius, Homo sum humani nihil mi alienum puto. I'm a man, nothing human is strange to me, said by a busybody in the play. And mine was Judaeus sum Islamiki nihil mi alienum puto. Well, the thing had an asterisk next to it. It had it translated into German and English. It had a footnote that I was playing on this, and I said to my colleague from the university there, Christian Weiser, I said to him, but this is a German university. Everybody knows Latin. He looked at me and to say, not anymore. So, but in any case, under the patronage of the caliphate in Baghdad had advisors who were non-Muslim, who were at the court, mainly Christian or Zoroastrian, also Jewish, and some of them were physicians, and they got the idea of translating the great works of science and philosophy into Arabic from the classical world, most of which they had not in the original Greek or Latin, but in Syriac, in Christian Aramaic. And they established an institution, the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in which this was carried out. And basically, the entire corpus of Greek science, mathematics, medicine was translated into Arabic. And by the way, it was lost in Europe at this time because it's only centuries later. The only thing they had of Aristotle, for example, were one or two short essays that had been translated into Latin and so on. And it's only later in Spain, again, which of course was under Islamic rule, and then even as the Reconquista starts, that the influence of this, and this starts to get translated back into Latin, and then of course that gives you the Renaissance.
From there, how did Muslim-Jewish relation evolve under caliphates? Could you also explain the dhimmi system, both the legal framework and what it meant for daily life?
Well, we've come now to we're up in Baghdad, which is this great flourishing center. Remember, also this was right on the Silk Road routes from India and China going westward. So it had influences that had long since been lost in the Mediterranean world. You had merchants who plied this route. One of the Arab. By the way, the Arabs developed the science of geography. We have volumes in Arabic on world geography, but it's more than geography, just what is where, but what we call in the academic world human geography. What are people like there? What do they do? And so on. For example, one of the great Arab geographers there in Baghdad at the Caliphal court, writes a word. His name is Ibn Khordadbeh, which you can hear again. It's not Arabic, it's Persian. Ibn is Arabic, but Khordadbeh is Persian. And in his geography, for example, he writes about these Jewish merchants who go from China to India, to the Near East, into the Mediterranean, into the Byzantine world, into the Latin Christian world, and so on. And what do they bring in one direction? What do they bring back in the other direction? And this is an extremely sophisticated society. Also, because of the translations of philosophy and so on, you have in the Islamic community itself, in the intellectual community, in the religious world, you have groups that develop a much more philosophical brand of Islam, a much more open one. And this is a time, for example, when the strictest rules of the Pact of Omar, the dress code, and so on, are not strictly enforced. We can see that. We also see people complaining. There are religious people who say, "Look, you shouldn't be allowing this," and so on. So you do have tension. You do have tensions. But in any case, you have a brand of Islam which is dominant, at least for a good part of the century in Baghdad, which is heavily philosophical. And we see Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Muslims belonging to this now at least elite dominant group having open discussions. And it's interesting, a Spanish Muslim traveler who comes to Baghdad in the 9th century, he said, "I went to one of these places where the people of philosophy meet and talk, and one of them said, and it says in our scriptures," and the others hoot him down and say, "You don't accept our scriptures, we don't accept yours. Here we only argue on the basis of reason and science." And he said, "I went to another place and another place and another place, and it was the same disaster everywhere." This was, of course, before Spain opened up more in Islamic Spain as well. This goes on. The relation. For example, we see descriptions of how Jewish courtiers or Christian courtiers are accepted at the Caliphal court in Baghdad, and this, while things are going well, this goes on, but then there's a turn for the worse. First of all, you have many religious figures who said, "No, this is not Islam. This is not what Islam says or permits." And the dress, for example, the dress code is reintroduced with much stricter administration in the later 9th century. Again, there'll be times that they ease up on it, but it's, at times, by the way, the dress code and certainly this was true in the later Middle Ages, when the Islamic world is becoming far more, what shall I say, fundamentalistic and turning in on itself. For example, wearing badges, or having the people color coded. Jews wear, for example, under the Mamluks, Jews wear yellow, Christians wear red, and so on. Each of them having these color codes, and as I said, specific badges, patches. The origin of the Christian badge for Jews, which comes in Europe only in the 13th century, with the 1215. What was the? I'm in a different world now. The which counts. It was one of the many church councils where they order Jews to wear a yellow circle and which you see, for example, in medieval illustrations of Jews wearing this. And the other one was the tabula, the 10 Commandments, also on a yellow thread on their clothing. Up until that time, they didn't do that. Yeah, that already existed in the Muslim world, but it was on again, off again, on again, off again. By the time we get to the 13th century, remember, Islam. First of all, the Islamic world underwent a great deal of tension. It broke up into different political bodies. The original caliphate already lost Spain in the middle of in the beginning of the 9th century. So you had an independent caliphate in Spain for a while. You had an independent caliphate that the Shiite Fatimids established, which ran from today's Morocco all the way to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and what's today Israel. So you had 3 different caliphates at one point, and the Fatimid one actually was a liberal one. It was very liberal to Jews. That changes again. North Africa, again, you have it going, especially as more and more in Islam, you have the beginning of what are called madrasas. It just means school, but these are religious institutions which taught a formalized form of Islam. And when you get to the 11th, 12th century, especially the 12th century, these become standard, that religious leaders come out of these schools where they have a set curriculum. And then that's when Islam starts to become very, very strict towards non-Muslims. Also, of course, you have other things. You have the Crusades coming in. You have the Reconquista in Spain, with Christians taking back more and more of the peninsula, and so on. And very often, when you're under pressure, then you harden, you tighten up. And this becomes until the time of the Ottoman conquest of the Middle East. The Ottomans are Central Asian horse-riding Turks. Although they consider themselves good Muslims, on the other hand, they've just conquered a large piece of land, both from Christians and from Muslims. And at first, they want to be open. It's in their best interest, and so on. And of course, when the Christians, the Catholics, expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492, Portugal in 1497, and Sicily in 1497, the Ottomans welcomed them in. Because they want the technology, the Ottomans, one of the reasons why they were able to defeat the Mamluks is the Ottomans believed gunpowder was a great thing. They had cannons. They made good use of it. And in fact, among the Jews from Spain who came into the Ottoman Empire, among their occupations, was the making of explosives and cannons. So they were, of course, welcomed. In any case, but then, after about 100 years, the Ottomans begin to be the Ottoman religious establishment begins to become more formalized and put back into strict observance all of the restrictions on Jews and Christians, the clothing, etc., etc., etc. But still in all, so you can see it's not one. Unfortunately, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you have a tendency to depict the history of Jews in the Islamic world as either all dark or all bright. And of course, history doesn't work that way. And there are periods of ups and downs, but the up periods were really among the best in Jewish diaspora history. Remember, the greatest Jewish thinkers are of the Middle Ages, Moses, Maimonides, and so on. These are from the Islamic world. They were not living in small, compact ghettos as in Christian Europe. They were not getting expelled later on, yes, but in the medieval period, yes, there were ups and downs, but the periods of up were considerable and left a long impression on Jewish culture.
Compared to Christian Europe in the same period, was this a harsher, better, or simply different reality?
Oh, the Islamic theology, first of all, look, Islam has all religions have negative things to say about other people. The important thing, of course, is what do you choose, especially very often you have contradictory things in scripture, in religious writings, and so on. Compared to Christian Europe, now again, because the people who want to paint it all in dark colors or all in bright colors, there are people who want to say that this was just as bad in one as the other. There were times it was as bad, but there were other times when it was eminently better, and that Islam, although it has certainly, the Quran has some very unkind things to say about Jews, among other things, that they're hypocrites. They're actually worse than Christians, and so on. But it also looks. That being said, it never takes away the recognition it has of Judaism as a divinely given religion. And compared to, if I have to make this better, worse, what was your third one?
Excuse me?
The three possibilities.
It was harsher, better, or simply a different reality?
Two of the three. It was different, and it's certainly and I'm saying this with the comma, and now and at times it was far better. It wasn't always better, but yes, at times it was far better. For example, that's one of the reasons why you have a great deal of acculturation in the Islamic world. Food, clothing. By the way, here Islam considers kosher meat to be halal. It is permissible for Muslims to eat it. Christians and Jews do not eat each other's meat at all. I mean, I'm talking about traditionally religious. Obviously, today it's a different world. But in any case, and what it allowed Jews to be under the Islamic law, a Christian or a Jew may not have authority over a Muslim. However, see, that's the thing is, you have these. However, in practice, you have Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians who served in the bureaucracy, who even could rise to high positions in court. That was not something that, yes, you do have court Jews in Christian Europe, many of whom, by the way, end up being burned at the stake or hanged or drawn and quartered. Sometimes that did happen to non-Muslims in authority too. That sometimes happens to Muslims in authority. But the fact is that you have many more examples of Christians and Jews in government service. Then Islam, again, that's the great thing with legal systems. You can find ways to work these in. And so, for example, okay, you can have a Christian or Jew who has authority, but he has to have a Muslim who has authority over him, and so on. And so, just to give you an example, you had in Islamic Cordoba, yes, the chief advisor in Cordoba, the chief advisor to the caliph was Hastai ibn Shaprut. He, in fact, it's interesting how they adopted in these good periods. He held, just as Muslim rulers held parties in which poets spoke and musicians sang and so on. He did the same thing. This is in 10th century Cordoba, and one of his court poets adopts the Arabic poetry as the highest art form in the Arab world. It's a very refined art with meter, rhyme, and so on. He adopts Hebrew poetry to this, and this becomes the standard form of Hebrew poetry throughout the Islamic world up till modern times. And then Samuel Hanagid, Samuel ibn Nagrela, becomes the chief vizier. Again, technically, the vizier should not be a Christian or a Jew, but there were Muslim rulers. In this case, the Muslim ruler happened to be a Berber from North Africa, and so he was a bit of an outsider too, and so he could be more liberal. And we see this in many. That doesn't mean it was always like that, but for example, because of that, the German Jewish historians of the 19th century, of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, who founded modern Jewish studies, created this whole image of the golden age of Spain, in which you had this flourishing of culture and so on. And since you all read German, you can read their works. The first major work on when I was growing up in New York, every Jewish home had and this was an edited translation of Grätz's Geschichte der Juden, which in the German original is I forget how many volumes, 12, I think. We had it in a 6 or 7 volume. One whole volume is just on Islamic Spain, because for them, living in 19th century Germany, Austria, and all of Central Europe, this was the ideal. This was what they wanted to achieve there. Of course, they romanticized it a bit. And then you had the counter, which said, no, it was. And again, I'm from the middle of the road path that says that, and this is true in much of history, that it's not all the way one side or the other.
These periods of cultural flourishing and coexistence, could you elaborate on the example of the House of Wisdom?
Well, the House of Wisdom, of course, is a unique institution, here under government, the caliphate is supporting this. They are translating all of Greek philosophy, science, and so on into Arabic, and because of this. Not only, of course, do you have great Islamic philosophers, but Jewish philosophers as well. From the Middle Ages, all of them, they knew their Plato and Aristotle and so on. But then in medicine, the great works of Dioscorides de Materia Medica, which is the great work on drugs and so on and so forth, which was the most advanced of that period. All of this gets translated into Arabic. By the way, another thing that happens in Baghdad is the establishment of the first real hospitals. You had up in medieval Europe, in classical Greece and Rome, a hospital was a religious institution. In Greece, it was the temple of Aesculapius. In Christian Europe, it was a monastery where you had monks who knew something about medicine, but in a practical sense, they didn't have books of medicine and so on and so forth until this material comes back into Europe via Arabic translation, into Hebrew translation, and then into Latin translation. There's a whole literature on this, and you'll forgive my German, it's sehr schwach, but the Hebräische Übersetzungen in Mittelalters, and it's on the translations, the translations that took place in Spain by Jews of the Arabic works into Hebrew, and then into Latin, and that's how it comes. It comes into. But hospitals were religious institutions. And you only went to them if you were a member of that religion. Muslims, with the Beit al-Hikmah, now establish hospitals. They give them a Persian name, Bimaristan, a place for the ill, and the physicians are Muslims, they're Christians, they're Jews, the kinds of people who were involved with the Beit al-Hikmah. And these institutions were, you have them in Baghdad, then you have them in other places as well. These are the first hospitals, as nowadays you don't even use the word. In Bimaristan usually means in a lot of Arabic dialects, and they use an Arabic word, mustashfa, for hospital now. But these were secular institutions, and this is a direct outcome of the Beit al-Hikmah and the kind of people who were there and the kinds of materials that it translated. By the way, Beit al-Hikmah only exists for close to a century, and then that's gone too, because of course, again, that's when the madrasas start. Islam starts turning in on itself. It's also under pressure as the Islamic, the caliphate, the Dar al-Islam, is breaking up into individual states and so on. And you have pressure from the outside with the Crusades. This is a short-term period, but it was a brilliant one.
On the other hand, what patterns of discrimination or violence do we see recurring before the modern age? Is there a distinct tradition of anti-Semitism, or has it mostly inherited its tropes from Christian anti-Judaism?
That's a good question, and it's a complicated one. Among other things, I was on the editorial board of the Encyclopedia of Anti-Semitism, and I just did a long thing on medieval Islamic anti-Judaism, which I preferred as a title for the article for the forthcoming Cambridge History of Anti-Semitism. Terms are used. Islam has anti-Jewish notions. You have them in the Quran, you have them in Islamic writing, and so on. You have positive ones as well. Remember that there's a balance sometimes, not a good balance, but there's a balance. I prefer the term anti-Semitism is only coined in the beginning of the 19th century as a philosophical term for being against Jews. It's a racial term, and so on and so forth. If you mean are there anti-Jewish notions, the answer is yes. But I don't like using the term anti-Semitism when talking about traditional Islamic, what I call anti-Judaism. Yes, sometimes there's an overlap in prejudice. Prejudices are the kinds of things that can overlap. But in any case, traditional Islamic anti-Judaism is based on a number of things. One, the Prophet's encounter with the Jews of Medina. He is brought into Medina in 632. There were two warring Arab tribes. They want to make peace with each other. They need an outsider to do this. They've been to Mecca at the pilgrimage. They meet and hear the Prophet. They ask him to come and to take over. The Jews of Medina, of course, had no part in this. They had been allied there were three Jewish tribes. Some were allied with one, some were allied with the other, and they had no say in Muhammad's coming. Muhammad comes, he issues a document, everybody's place in the new community in Medina, including the Jews. But then, of course, when he preaches, he, instead of having them say, yes, that's what the good book says, they say, no, you've got it wrong. And this already early on makes for problems. And he still is not in complete control of everything. Eventually, he exiles one of the Jewish tribes with all of their property and everything. Later on, as he's growing in power, he exiles the second tribe, this time taking their property. And the third time, with the people of Mecca, when they attack and so on, he blames, although the Jews do not fight on their side, he blames them as really supporting them. He executes all the men and sells the women and children into slavery. But afterwards, they conquer neighboring Khaybar Oasis a year or so later, which is a Jewish oasis, and the Jews surrender as long as they pay taxes, 50% of the date crop at the time. They're free to stay there, and so on. This becomes, by the way, the legal basis of jizya, capitation tax, in later times, which is a different tax. Eventually, there were Jews. Most Jews still lived in villages, and many were still agricultural in the 7th century. And those who lived in villages and towns, and this includes Christians as well, paid a tax on the land, a kharaj. So there was jizya and kharaj. This was a tax burden. It's a good incentive for many people to convert to Islam, but many people also continue. Then they converted to Islam. Then Islam is losing a source of taxes. So then they declare land which was owned originally by Jews and Christians, Kharaj land, still has to pay Kharaj even if a Muslim owns it. Eventually that also is pushed aside. But as you can see, it's not one set thing right away. In any case, aside from the Islamic, the Quranic various statements about Jews and so on, you also have in the Hadith. Hadith are the traditions on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, things that he said and did. And it's like Talmudic literature for Jews. The Hadith is volumes, and there are 5 Orthodox Hadith, all things supposedly Muhammad said and did. Sometimes they're contradictory, just as the Talmud has contradictory things. But 2 of them are considered to be the most authoritative. They're considered to be sahih, as they're called in Arabic. These where most of the traditions on Jews are for Orthodox Islam come. But again, there's a wide variety. There's a wide variety of these things. The Jews shouldn't be trusted. That's said. Let me just give you also from the Talmud. There are two Talmuds: the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud says the best of the Gentiles, they have their place in the world to come. Palestinian Talmud has a statement: the best of Gentiles, even the best of Gentiles, deserve death. Judaism, thank goodness, takes the Babylonian Talmud as the authoritative one there, and not the other. Also, of course, when you're not a dominant people, you have a tendency to be easier going. But in any case, in the good periods of Islamic, by the way, the dinar, the famous economic historian at Yale years ago, can't think of his name now. He's Italian. He wrote a thing, the dinar, the dollar of the Middle Ages. The Islamic currency became the world currency in a way that the dollar became later on. And remember, Islam, the Prophet was a merchant. Unlike Christianity, Christianity looks down upon mercantile activity. That they inherited, by the way, from the Romans and the Greeks to a lesser extent, but the Romans particularly. In classical civilization, owning land was the sign of being really noble. Whereas in Islam, commerce is something highly respected, and therefore, again, Jews did well in the Islamic system. One of the traditional wishes when you went on the pilgrimage to Mecca was Hajj Maqbool, Vang Maghfur, wa Tijara la Tabur. May your pilgrimage be accepted. May your sins be forgiven, and may your merchandise not go unsold. Because people took merchandise with them when they went. Remember, the travel took a long time. You had to get to Mecca. You had to get back. And because of that, we see from the Cairo Geniza, this great collection of manuscripts, that Jews and Muslims could be business partners, and they were. They could engage in trade together. They obviously, if they owned a store, the Jew was an observer of the Sabbath. Either the store was closed, depending who was the major owner, or the business that was conducted on Saturday was only done by the Muslim, and the money involved only went to him. And so there were ways of dealing with this. When do things begin to? Well, first of all, and this is another principle to keep in mind. Christians and Jews, non-Muslims, did best, very often under sectarian Muslim rule. Why? Because sectarians make up their own rules and don't necessarily go by the strict. And so for example, Fatimid Egypt and North Africa and the Near East, the Fatimids looked at the Caliph as divinely inspired, as being like the Pope after Council of Trent, as being infallible, and so he could have Christians and Jews as he could have in army command positions, in high government positions, and so on. He was looked upon by Orthodox Muslims, of course, as a heretic. And by the way, the Druze of the Middle East today, one of the caliphs By the way, but they could do best and worst. The Fatimid ruler Al-Hakim he ruled over, among other things, Jerusalem, and he heard about the miracle of the fire coming down on Easter to light the torches down below. He was a tourist; he wanted to see it, and in the press, he's almost killed. And he orders that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre be destroyed, which is eventually, by the end of that century, becomes one of the reasons why the Crusades took place. In any case, then there's persecution of Christians, and very often persecution of Christians is then followed by, and vice versa, persecution of Jews is followed by persecution of Christians. In 1947, after the UN vote on the partition of Palestine, there were the riots in many cities in the Islamic world, Cairo among others, in Tripoli, in Libya, and so on, against Jews. But right away, these riots then spread, and they were against the Copts and the Greek Orthodox. In other words, when it comes to Ahl al-Dhimma, one attitude is, you've seen one, you've seen them all. And very often, persecution of one group could become persecution of another. Violence against one group, violence against another. And we see this time and time again. In North Africa, you don't see it because after the Almohads, here's an example of a sectarian group. Almohad means al-Muwahidun, the Unitarians. They believed in the strict unity of God, the strict unity of the Prophet Muhammad, and so on. And they commanded all Christians and Jews in Spain and North Africa to convert to Islam. This is the Christianity. Remember, St. Augustine is from North Africa. Christianity, which had a huge base in North Africa, at this point, 13th century, disappears forever, only except for with colonialism and colonists coming in later in the 19th century. But Judaism, Jews continued to practice Judaism secretly, Maimonides being one of these individuals. Jews in Europe couldn't understand how could the Jews of Spain and North Africa openly pretend to be Muslims and secretly practice Judaism. And Maimonides and also his father write famous essays of comfort in which they point out, unlike Christianity, Islam is not idolatry. There are no images. Also, the unity of God. And so forth, and that yes, that it is. One should, of course, until one can get to a safer place, secretly practice one's Judaism, but observing Islam, which in any case doesn't call for eating pork and things of that sort, which allows circumcision, all these things, and so Judaism survived in North Africa and in Spain, whereas Christianity did not. It disappeared forever. But the fact is that here, one of the worst periods was a shared period. But again, it's against Islamic law to force a dhimmi to convert to Islam. It's strictly against Islamic law. But if you're a sectarian, you have laws that supersede the laws, or you have interpretations of them which supersede them. And that happened in Yemen also in the 13th century, where Jews were forced to convert to Islam. And then, again, being forced to convert to Islam, you could practice Judaism secretly, which would be very difficult under Christianity. You had you did have in Spain the Marranos, the crypto Jews, after 1492. For the most part, they never returned to Judaism. A few did when they could get out of there, but most did not.
In the 19th century, European colonial powers advanced into North Africa and the Middle East. How did this affect life in the region?
The answer is, this is the beginning. European penetration, of course, physical penetration comes with Napoleon and the invasion of Egypt. But already mercantile penetration had become very important since the 16th century, and partially encouraged by the Ottomans to no small extent. But then in the 19th century, for example, you have, on top of the commercial penetration and with Napoleon, the physical penetration, you also have the religious intellectual penetration. You have missionaries who come into the Middle East in the 19th century. Now, it's a death penalty in Islam to try to convert a Muslim. So they did not turn to converting Muslims. They turned to either converting Jews or to converting Christians to their brand of Christianity. And one of the things the missionaries did in the 19th century was to establish modern schools. And mostly these schools were for Christians, but they brought modern education at a time when the Islamic world was at a low point in its general educational, cultural, and economic level. Furthermore, you have what I call intellectual, educational missionaries. In 1870, you have the first international Jewish educational philanthropic association founded, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Alliance, and they saw Jewish progression in modern world will come with education, and they established schools first in Morocco in 1872, in Tlemcen, and then in the following 2 years later in Tangier, and then by the 19th century, by 1900, every city in the Islamic world, major city, from Morocco to Iran, had at least an Alliance school, at least one, and they included schools for girls, something which was unheard of in that part of the world for Jews, Christians, or Muslims. And by 1900, you already had 100,000 Jews who came out of the Alliance schools with a European education, also a Jewish religious education, but mainly in language, French, of course, because it was in mathematics, etc., geography, and so on. And this along with the missionary schools for Christians, but also had Jews who attended them, opened up doors for progress. And Jews and Christians in the 19th century became the major intermediaries between Muslims and the rest of the world, because they could now deal with learning foreign languages was considered to be not terribly respectable in the Muslim world. And now you had people who could speak all the way. This, by the way, goes back already centuries before, that the people who did, Christians and Jews, who were the intermediaries with Christian merchants, with consulates and so on, they were the Christians and the Jews, because they had no objections to learning other languages. And on top of that, the Christian missionaries opened the first universities in the Islamic world. The Protestants opened what became the University of Beirut, and the Catholics opened up what was it called? L'Université de Saint-Joseph, also in Beirut. The first newspapers are now issued, all owned by Christians, unfortunately, one of the things that come along with this 19th century was when anti-Semitism in its scientific form, its philosophical form, is really developing in Europe. And that's why I prefer, Yusuf, when you had asked about anti-Semitism and so on, I preferred anti-Judaism for the medieval version. But more of what we would call anti-Semitic ideas are now being propagated in the 19th century by the Arabic press. Al-Ahram in Egypt, the pyramids is what these are all owned by Christians. The main writers are Christians. And this is a time also when anti-Semitic notions, the blood libel, Islam, because it has dietary laws like Jews, knows full well Jews don't consume blood with the meat. It has to either be drained at the time of slaughter and then roasted, or the meat, if it's not going to be roasted, has to be covered with rock salt to draw out more of the blood before cooking it, especially in a pot. And the blood libel that Jews killed Christians to take their blood to make matzah for Passover. This was a medieval Christian idea that now suddenly appears in the Muslim world in 1830 in Damascus. A Christian missionary, a Capuchin friar, disappears. He was last seen near the Jewish quarter of Damascus, and the French consul in Damascus says, the Jews' holiday of Passover is coming up in another month and a half. Maybe he was killed by the Jews for his blood. All the Jews, he gets all the governor of Damascus to arrest all of the Jews, that Jewish men. They're tortured. One of them says, yes, a Jewish barber, that he was got killed for his blood, and so on. In any case, leading Jewish philanthropists and leaders in Europe, Moses Montefiore in England, he was a close friend of Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, sorry, and Adolphe Crémieux in France, first one of the first modern French political leaders as well. They go to the Middle East and go to see the ruler of Egypt, the Sultan who was the direct ruler for Syria at the time. They go to Istanbul and see Constantinople and see the Sultan. And the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire issues a firman, a decree that these accusations are totally against anything Judaism believes or practices. But the idea that it had come in and was given credence even locally, this now becomes, unfortunately, a standard trope in anti-Semitic propaganda in the Middle East. I actually wrote about it once. I could send you the article on what I called new ideas in Islam and how this comes into textbooks and so on. But this is a modern phenomenon. And by the way, one of the things you have to understand, since you're dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestine conflict, an issue, and so on, this is before that. But it's taken up in the propaganda and back and forth, and unfortunately comes to have an enormous, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was one of the great works of anti-Semitism, Jews being an international group trying to take over the world, that rule the economy, gets translated into Arabic several times, and then again becomes a standard piece in this in this polemic. But it is a modern phenomenon with its roots in the 19th century. It does not. There are other things. There are other in folklore. There are things against Jews and against Christians and so on. But this one, which is one of the most ghastly, this one only comes in the 19th century, and then is spread as time goes on.
At the same time, Arab nationalism was beginning to stir, but also movements like the Muslim Brotherhood emerged. What did change for Jewish communities and how did they respond?
That's again. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is a 20th century phenomenon. It only begins in the early 20th century, and around 1919, I believe. I'm getting to a certain age where I have to look up dates now again, and so on. But in any case, Arab nationalism, the roots of it go back. It only develops in the 20th century, but the roots, in fact, go back to the missionary activities and to the intellectual circles at the universities that are established by Christian missionaries in Beirut, in Cairo. The American University of Cairo was a Protestant missionary institution. As I said, University of Beirut and the L'Université de Saint-Joseph are both such institutions. And one of the things, many things take place that are going on at the same time and interweave. And one of them, for example, is what we call the Nahda. The Nahda is literally enlightenment, but it's the revival of modern Arabic language, culture, and basically it's the movement to modernism. But this takes place in a Christian environment. The first great dictionary of Arabic since the Middle Ages is edited at the University of Beirut by a Protestant Arab, and so is the first grammar of modern. You have to understand the Arab world, in no small measure to this day, but certainly till the 19th century, was like Europe in the Middle Ages before Dante writes his Divine Comedy, before you had a Chanson de Roland in French, before you have any of the great literature, the epics of Christian literature. Up until that time, what we call Spanish, what we call Portuguese, what we call French, Italian, were called vulgar Latin. But the only language you could read, again, up until these people came along and wrote literature in vulgar Latin, was Latin. Most people were illiterate. And this was the case in the Arab world as well. 19th century comes along, and these universities and the missionary schools, and one of the things they do is to take literary Arabic, drop a lot of literary Arabic is like Latin, it has case endings. Drop a lot of the case endings, simplify the grammar a little bit, but not much. And that becomes modern literary Arabic. The vast majority of people in the Arab world couldn't understand it. Now more and more because of the media and so on. But I remember it being in Morocco in the 1970s with family and listening to the news on television. And they would ask me, what exactly did he say? These were native speakers who spoke Arabic at home, but the older generation had not gone to school, and therefore had a limited knowledge of the literary language In any case, this is the process that takes place, and with that, of course, that comes a form of nationalism. What's interesting, many of the first Arab nationalists, especially who call themselves Arab nationalists, are Christian, because now they could go from being Christian dhimmis who spoke Arabic in a Muslim environment to being part of a nation. And when you look, by the way, at the 20th century, at many of the political movements, the more radical ones, communists, socialists, etc., or in the later on with the Palestinians, because there's no Palestinian yet as a notion. Who are the really radical movements? Led by Christians. This is true in Iraq. This is true. Why? Because they could leave this traditional status. However, at the same time, you had religion still is the prime identity in much of the Middle East, and for Muslims, Arabic-speaking Muslims, the word Arab had come to mean by the Middle Ages only Bedouin. Nobody from Egypt called himself an Arab. Nobody from Morocco called himself an Arab. It was except for Arab tribesmen who were Bedouin, and so on. You were a Damascene. Your city was your identity, or your religion. And with modern nationalism, there were those who were the pan-Ottomanists. Some of the Jews were pan-Ottomanists because the Ottoman Empire looked like it was a better deal than perhaps one that would have been the local Muslim community. Sometimes, but this is Arab nationalism really only begins to grow with the Ottoman reforms, in part because they do away with a lot of the exemptions that non-Muslims had. Also, the Young Turks are particularly militant, and this is turning people in places like Syria, like what is today Lebanon, like the Levant, and so on. The only country which had a real national movement, and here it had Christians, Jews, and Christians, Muslims, and Jews who were part of it, was Egypt. And in a sense, I sometimes explain to students to this day, and I perhaps shouldn't because we're doing too many things and just dropping this here and there, but there are only two countries that are real countries, for example, in the Arabic-speaking world. Might be liberal and say three, but two really. One of them is Egypt, and one of them is Morocco. Why? Because Egypt has a history that you see all over the place. The whole country, as big as it is basically 6 miles on either side of the Nile, and the rest of it is empty desert, nearly empty desert. And it has had its own rulers for long periods of time. It also has a dialect which is extremely unique to it, and which, by the way, and it has great writers and movies and so on in the dialect. And the other one is Morocco, where you have the same dynasty ruling the country since the beginning of the 16th century. And before that, you had dynasties that ran for hundreds of years. All of the others, especially in the part of the Middle East where I live, the Levant, were basically divided ethnically. There was a very good book. I can't think of his name right now. He was an American correspondent in Beirut. He was kidnapped by the Shiites before the Hezbollah Amal. He was held 6 months in a desert confinement. He escaped, and he went back and he wrote a book called Tribes with Flags. That basically there was no sense of nationhood in many of these places, and that the ethnic identity, religious identity, tribal identity was far stronger than any of the other so-called national. The national identities are modern phenomena, but the Arab national movement, again, Christians played a very active role. Very few Jews were attracted to it. Very few, in part because they had their own up-and-coming national identity, which is there were waves of Jewish national identity in history. You have, for example, over 10,000 Spanish Sephardim come into the Holy Land following the expulsion of 1492. Whole cities are reestablished, including the religious centers, the four religious centers of Hebron, Jerusalem, Tiberias, and up in the Galilee Mountains, the Mystic Center. Again, to come back, you had already when the Almohads come along, you have a wave of these. Of course, are messianic national movements. But Judah Halevi, the greatest of all medieval Hebrew poets, who was in Spain, and then he comes, makes a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and already in the late 9th century, Karaite Jews. These are like a Protestant movement within Judaism, call for Jews to return to their homeland. By the way, remember I said that Jews couldn't live in Jerusalem after the Romans after they rebelled, the Romans threw them out. Who allowed them to return? The Caliph Omar. Even though the Patriarch of Jerusalem, when they surrendered, said, "We surrender, but please don't let the Jews come back to Jerusalem," he allowed it. So that they, for the most part, were not attracted to Arab nationalism. Egyptian nationalism, yes. You had a Jew in the cabinet of King. Let's see, which king is it now? It's before Farouk. It's his father. But in the 1920s, a Jew was a minister of the postal system, and so on. The Morocco also, in the first cabinet after they're freed from France, you have a Jew chief advisor to the King of Morocco today is André Azoulay, who's Jewish. And Jewish history is taught in Moroccan schools as part of Moroccan history. I mean, when I say Jewish history, I mean the history of Jews in Morocco. You have nothing like that in other countries. So they were much less attracted in Iraq. The modern nationalism did attract Jews and Christians, but mostly to the radical movements, communist, socialist, etc. The mainstream Arab nationalist movements fell into two categories: Islamist, that is, with a strong Islamic identity, saying that we're the ones who rule, or a wider national identity, which in the end lost out anyway.
Was there a Zionist movement in our countries, and how was Zionism debated in Jewish communities in Baghdad, Cairo, or Casablanca, and how was it seen by Muslim neighbors?
Good question. Obviously, there were places where one could be more open and places less so. In Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, of course, it's under French rule. actually the Jews of Algeria, as of the Khmer decree, the same Khmer who went to get the Sultan to sign a declaration that blood libel is totally false and against Jewish practice and belief and so on. Khmer got the French government in 1870 to give French citizenship to the Jews of Algeria, which is why, by the way, it's the one Islamic community of Jews, Islamicate, if you want to use academic terminology, Islamicate Jewish community, which overwhelmingly settled in France. Of the 120,000 Algerian Jews, about 100,000 went to France with the French colons who left after the Algerian Civil War and de Gaulle giving them independence. As in various and sundry other places, the Jewish newspapers, for example, in Iraq, had pro-Zionist material, and the Jewish newspapers in Morocco and in Tunisia. You had others that, of course, when you're a minority and when there's a dominant and sometimes hostile majority, you learn to be discreet. And so, for example, the Jewish scouts in many of the Islamic countries were very Zionistly oriented, but they tended to be in closed communities. What's interesting is the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools, which, remember, are turning out all of these Western-educated Jews in the Islamic world. The Alliance was officially, as of about 1890s, anti-Zionist. By the end of World War I, the head of the Alliance school goes to there's the convention held, and makes a statement against Zionism. But the majority of the teachers, remember, they taught modern Hebrew. The majority of the teachers and the parents were pro-Zionist. And I remember writing Jews of Arab Lands in Modern Times, doing work in the archives, and I find a letter in the Alliance archives from the Alliance to the head of a school in Tunisia. We're getting reports that your schools have Zionist activities in them. What's going on? And he writes back, these are extracurricular activities. They're and so on and so forth. But then, of course, World War II comes along. The Alliance is banned by the Vichy government of France. The schools still continue to exist, not as Alliance schools, but as Jewish schools in much of the Middle East, and they become bases of strong bases of Jewish identity and of modern Zionism. And of course, you have to understand the World War II experience in particular. The Palestinian national movement, which really gets started around 1919, when Haj Amin al-Husseini is appointed by the British as the Mufti of the Mandate of Palestine. By 1929, he is actively promoting not just merely Palestinian nationalism, but anti-Semitism. 1929, at the meeting in Cairo, already such things as the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that the Jews are trying to take over the world, begin to spread. And in the 1930s, he has representatives, usually traveling as tourists, because they're not allowed to be traveling as political representatives, going into various Arab countries, including North Africa, and speaking in mosques and propagating an anti-Jewish version of Palestinian Arab nationalism. And then, of course, you have the riots of 1936. He has to escape from mandatory Palestine because the British are going to arrest him. He goes to Iraq, and he's there with the Iraqi nationalists, who, when World War II breaks out, throw out both the boy king and his mentor, and then when the British come back in, he flees, and of course flees just the day before the British authority comes back. The pro-British authority comes back, and that's when the Farhud, which was one of the few really big pogroms of the World War II period, takes place. And for the most part, I mean, the Jews of Iraq, like the Jews of Syria, as of already the 1920s, behaved discreetly simply because the radical nationalism was so strong. And of course, many of them saw that their days were numbered. And after World War, the founding of the State of Israel, the vast majority of them left both of those countries.
How do you explain the rejection of the Zionist movement by the Arabs? Did they reject Zionism because they were Jewish or because they were European and seen as colonizers?
A little bit of one, a little bit of the other, but the objections to it, the real objections to it, only come with modern. Again, nationalism is a modern phenomenon, and modern nationalism in the Arab world really develops, partially, by the way, encouraged by the British and the French to be against the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, who is their enemy. Then, of course, they betray them in their own way. But remember, Faisal, the Sharif of Mecca, joins with the British, fights again. He's established in Damascus, and then he gets thrown out because the British have already made agreements with the French on how they're going to divide everything up, and so on. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is separate from, of course, the Balfour Declaration. In politics, people do those sorts of things, and nationalism takes on a momentum in the post-World War I period, just as it, by the way, as it does in Europe with all the countries that suddenly come into existence out of the Russian Empire, out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. Look, one of my grandfathers always told me he was Austrian. He remembers when his Kaiser Franz Josef came through their town. They all were out there at the railroad station to wave flags and meet him. Then I see on a map. I mean, I was a kid at the time. Then I see on a map. It's not Austria. It's not Hungary. It's Poland. He's from Galicia. But he spoke German with an Austrian, the Austrian musical form of German. No offense for the German form, but with the forward flap trill R and so forth. And the identities, all of these Slavic identities that become Yugoslavia and so on and so forth, these are all modern phenomena. Yes, people had identities. Of course they had identities. But national identity in the sense of nation, that's a modern phenomenon. And it takes its force when we get to World War I and the aftermath of World War I. And that's when this begins to be. Up until that time, look, Chaim Weizmann, the head of the Zionist world movement, he's meeting with King Faisal. He's wearing a headdress just like him, and so on. He gets Iraq as a booby prize, and his brother gets. They divide Palestine into Transjordan and the Mandate of Palestine. So he gets that, and this only heightened the feeling that somehow their nations were not properly taken care of. And look, even within Iraq, the people of northern Iraq, the Kurds, and the Assyrian Christians, they all rebel. They don't consider themselves part of an Islamic Arab nation. Had Iraq gone the route of a multicultural, but it didn't. And all this does is to strengthen either the religious nationalism, a form of nationalism, or a strict ethnic political form of nationalism. And that's been one of the problems. Look at a place like Libya. The way it's been torn up. Look at and other countries. And again, this is why Egypt and Morocco have been so much stronger. Morocco, almost 40% of the population is the indigenous, now politically correct. We call them Amaziren, which means free men in their language. What was called up until recently the Berbers. But the idea of the country they've been wise enough to hold on to that, and that is why Berber is now taught in schools in Morocco and so on. That is why they have done so much better than the Middle Eastern countries, other than Egypt. And even in Egypt, there are the Islamists who object to the kind of secular Egyptian identity that the ruling elite fosters. You mentioned the Islamic Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimun. They're illegal in Egypt. They had, of course, a president for a short while, but they have been suppressed because the country wants an Egyptian identity. The majority of people in Egypt want an Egyptian identity, not the Islamist identity. Not that the other isn't very strong. It is.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
That being said, this marks the end of our podcast. To you, Professor Stillman, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, for taking the time, a lot of time, answering all of our questions and doubts.
That's a long story.
It is, indeed.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good to meet you, and
likewise.
And I hope sometime we'll really meet in person.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.